guest here, Gerry Smyth, is from Durham. He's going to, well, I won't ruin his speech before we were here on March 1st, so it was outstanding. So if you were here before, you're going to catch some of it. But as he told me, he teaches class at UNH. He had classes in the morning and the afternoon, and no speech was the same. So, but let me say one thing. Heidi here from the library, outstanding Smyth Library here in Candia. They do a great job, and she was very appreciative that I could get Gerry to come again, and I'm very excited about this. So this is my friend Gerry Smyth. I won't take anything away from him, but set your watch because he likes to go long. So.
Very good, Gerry.
Well, thank you for the invitation to speak. Paul and I have been going around on what the meeting should be for quite a while, and I told a story the other day, but Paul says you can't tell it there, so that was my first 5 minutes. I was a freshman at the University of New Hampshire in 1941 when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. I was in Hood House, which is the college infirmary, with bleeding nose, and they'd packed my sinus, and eventually I got my tonsils out, and that was the end of my nosebleeds. Right after Pearl Harbor, the president of the university called an all-man's convocation, and back in those days, everybody was expected to go to convocation, and if you didn't, it cost you $5. And back then, $5 at 30 cents an hour was a lot of work, so most of the men went and got checked off. When we were coming out of the hall, the field house, it happened that we were three boys walking abreast, and we were not being overly kind to the president. And just as we got in front of T Hall, he tapped the boy in the middle and he said, "I agree with everything you boys have been saying." But he said, "Look at it from my standpoint." And then he went on to explain that there's so many enlistees that they couldn't even handle what they had. We had a place to sleep, we could go to school and stay until they were ready and could handle us, which made it a lot of sense, because eventually the volunteer pipeline got full and volunteers could choose their branch of service. Draftees was assigned, so most of the students enlisted in the branch of service that they were interested in. I enlisted in the reserves in November of 43, called up in February of 44, went through training down at Atlantic City, on the boardwalks of Atlantic City, then to Rochester, New York, to College Training Detachment, then from there to Nashville for what we call classification. They divided the people that wanted to fly up into pilot, applications, bombardiers, navigators, and if you didn't make any of those, then you could volunteer to fly on a crew, and you had to have a specialty. Everybody had except the pilots, had dual training. But we were trained to do everything on the plane, so we had a complete training. My flying was first while I was in a college training detachment up in Rochester, New York. Then after we went through classification, I went to Maxwell Field for what they call pre-flight, and everything was broken down into 2-month units. You went 2 months here, 2 months here, and it just moved right along up the ladder. And my first field was Bennettsville, South Carolina, which was in primary. We flew the PT-13. It was a biplane, single engine, gravity carburetor. And from there, we went to Shawfield, Sumter, South Carolina for basics. And when we got through 2 months of basics, we moved on to Seymour, Indiana, which is about halfway between Louisville, Kentucky, and Indianapolis. And we got what they call advanced twin engine training there. Some of us were sent to co-pilots right directly to Barksdale Field to become co-pilots. Some were picked to go on to what they call transition, which was from going from a training plane to an actual combat plane. And I was assigned Barksdale, Louisiana, with the B-26, the Martin Marauder. And the had a lot of names. The Marauder did. It was the Widowmaker. There was one a day in Tampa Bay. That's why they were flying out of. It was the Flying Prostitute, no visible means of support. And a few other names that I can't say here. And it was a real bad plane until General Doolittle came in, because they were having a lot of trouble, and Doolittle took the B-26 down, took off on a single engine, and that was the end of the arguments about the B-26 not being a good plane. We had our training, and everything works out. If you keep moving, you get through. And in February of '44, I got my wings. Now, is any young lad or lassie in here just about 21 years old? Is anybody with 21 years old? Stand up, please. Now, is anybody in here 29 years old? Do I see somebody? Okay. Just take a good look. Turn around so they can see it. Just take a good look, because this is the age group that did most of the flying during World War II. Wow. This young lad was assigned to a plane cost $1 million. He had 5 or 6, depending upon the particular mission, people under him at his age, plus the responsibility for the plane. So I just want you can sit down. I just wanted you to get some idea of the age of the pilots that were going into combat. We were assigned to go into the 12th Air Force, which was stationed over in Italy, and we flew from Morrison Field in southern Florida, down through Puerto Rico, South America, Belém, Brazil, Natal, Brazil, the Ascension Islands, Roberts Field in Gold Coast over in Africa, up through Casablanca and Dakar, Marrakech, and we were in a repo depot there in Tunis, and eventually I wound up in Sardinia, of course, Sardinia, with a good field as a co-pilot. The training program was that when you got over into, as a new crew coming in, the first pilot that you've been flying with was hooked up with another first pilot that had over 5 missions in. Everybody had to have at least 5 missions before he was eligible to be the pilot of a plane in combat in our group. And as soon as you co-pilot got over there, they put him with an old co-pilot that had been checked out, and was flying first pilot, and he got his training that way. And when he was eligible to they thought to pass the test, they'd give him a test, and if he could pass, he was assigned as a pilot, and then they waited for new crews to come in to start and build on another crew. I was stationed at Sardinia from late July until we moved up to Corsica in September. I'll just tell you one experience that we had that happened to my plane. I was flying co-pilot, and we were taking off D-Day in southern France, which was the 14th or either 14th or 15th of August, and we waited for a plane to blow up on the end of the runway, and I just facetiously reached over and poked the pilot, and I said, "Jonesy, wouldn't that be a hell of a thing to happen to us?" Well, when he put the sign up for the wheels to come up, was a bang under the right engine, and they'd gotten in the night and sabotaged the plane. And I don't think we ever got over 50 feet off the ground. We just flew straight and level in the pitch black, and fortunately we hit a knoll about like that, and we hit here, slid up over, down like this. Everybody got out of the plane, but the plane burned, and the only thing that was left was two nacelles and the two engines over the engine. And on the nacelles, some artist had taken the time to write "The Fickle Finger." We had good living conditions in Sardinia, and the missions got so long and the targets so far away that they finally moved us up to Corsica, which was a French possession before the war, and we used to rendezvous over Elba, for those of you that like to go back and study history. What else do I say? All right. The Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had been basically decimated. They went up on occasion, but not very often. Most of our problems came with flak. Our group hadn't seen any fighters since July. In November of '44, we took off for a mission at the northern end to drop bombs on a railroad interchange at the northern end of the Brenner Pass, which was a major supply route from Italy to Germany, both bringing replacements in and taking the injured and wounded out, and so it was a prime target. We hit some flak, but the worst was we got jumped by about 20 enemy fighters, and this is one of the few times that the stories have been verified. There was a study group that got together after the war. Basically, an Englishman started it, and they studied a lot of these reports. And if the American report, the German report, and the Italian report all agreed, then they said it must have happened, because they said they got those very, very few times. And there's a book up here that talks about that I participated in. There's two books up here. One is What If, and that's a little book I wrote for the family. And then my son and the family got together, and we went to Italy, and they wrote up another follow-up on that. We basically retraced the steps that I took as a prisoner of war. How were we treated? Well, what happened? As I told you, we got jumped by fighters. There was 18 of us. One of the was 2 planes shot down on the way into the target, and was a third one badly damaged, and they took credit for a kill. The Italian pilots did, but it turned out that the fellow flying the third one got right down on at the wave height on Lake Garda and made it back all the way to Corsica and ditched his plane just off Corsica, and was picked up by the water rescue people. And what happened was, as we broke away from the bomb run, the plane was in a position like this, and this ME-109 came up underneath with 20mm cannon and shot away the pedestal between the pilot and the co-pilot, which is just about the size of this. And the co-pilot always rode with his left arm on the pedestal like this, because the gas valves for both engines was there. And if you got hit in the engine, the first thing you did was shut it off, so that hopefully the gasoline didn't catch on fire and explode. Well, what happened was that 20mm flak took out everything there right down to the bone, and you could see the sinews and the muscles and the nerves just hanging down here. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And the pilot had what we called a seat chute. You put a harness on, and it was a square package like that, about like that, and about that deep. That was the pilot's parachute and the co-pilot. Because the navigator, the bombardier, the gunners had to move around the plane, they had just a plain harness on, and they carried their parachute in a roll about like that, big around and about that long. And they was 2 snaps like this, and they'd just do this, and that D-ring would snap into that, and they had their parachute on, but they could carry it in their hand as they moved around between the bomb racks and other places where they had to, wouldn't have been accessible if they'd had that big seat chute on. In order to get out of the B-26, you had 3 escape routes. One was right down through the nose wheel well. When the nose wheel was down, and slide doors back, you could see right straight down. The other one was up overhead and folded back like this. When we crash landed, we went out this way. When we were shot down, we went down through the nose wheel, and then back along the fuselage, there was the waste window on either side, and that's why the people that are flying up back, the tail gunner, the turret gunner, and the waste gunners they said that they had their chutes on, but 2 didn't jump. And so why, nobody knows, and nobody will ever know. So with this damage, I couldn't get off my chute, because you needed to be able to pull it like this, and I had absolutely no control over my hand. So I was picked up by the Germans almost immediately, and I was on the operating table, I would say, within 20 minutes from the time I was shot down. And all they did, I thought they'd cut off my arm. I didn't think there was any question about it. It looked that bad, but what they did is what they called debrided it, took out a lot of the flak, and trimmed it up, and put me in a body cast, and I was in a body cast with my arm like this from 5th of November until about mid-February. And by that time, they'd left a window in it, and they could change the dressing. They didn't have any soluble sulfur. They didn't have any antibiotics. The best thing that they had for infection was powdered sulfur, and they didn't use cloth bandages. They used paper bandages, and they didn't use what we'd call good anesthesia. They were still using chloroform as an anesthesia. And I was operated on, and then that night they were going to send us up to Murano, not Milano, but Murano, up in the mountain, up in the Alps. And so it was a resort city, and they said during the war was 100 hotels there. Only one was a hotel. All the other 99 were makeshift hospitals. And they were going to ship us up there. Well, I happened to know that we would drop some delayed action fuse bombs. I wasn't particularly interested in going out there that night, but I didn't say anything. I figured let them learn. I'd have to take my chances with them. And we couldn't go, and it was about 3 or 4 days before we could travel. And then we traveled in ambulances from Rovietto up to Murano, and it was a good cloudy day, thank goodness, because no airplanes were flying. And I stayed in Murano from about to mid-May. Let me get this right. Yes, from mid-May until mid-February. No, mid-November to mid-February. Just in case you are wondering about my stammering some, I had a stroke a few years ago, and my mind isn't quite as clear as far as dates and numbers go, but the rest of it is just as clear as if it happened yesterday. Wow. And I saw somewhere on TV the other night that somebody was saying that if you have a near-death experience, that your life goes by you like a movie reel. And this happened to me on the way down. My whole life went just like that, right in front of me. And eventually I got into a POW camp. I didn't get into a POW camp until the middle of February, and it was Spital, Austria, and it was they called it a prisoner of war hospital, and it was run by the British that were taken in the First El Alamein and early on in the African desert, and they were the medical people we had, and they were furnished very, very, very limited supply of medical supplies. So I stayed there until my hand had healed up enough so that I could travel, and then they put 5 or 6 of us PWs together with 3 German guards, and from the time I left Spital in mid-February, we never stayed anywhere longer than 10 days. We were on the move constantly, and strangely enough, that was a much more attractive situation than being in a prison camp, because we got a lot better food, but we were also exposed to the war itself. We got into Frankfurt on Main, and we were supposed to go up to Dulag Luft, which was the Air Force prisoner of war camp, and they said the Americans were 4 days out, so they sent us back to Nuremberg. And on the way to Nuremberg, we were strafed 3 times in less than 2 hours by our own planes. It was on a train, and those P-47s did a job. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever seen a 50 caliber machine gun slug? I'll just hold one up. There's 6 of those coming out of the leading edge of the wing of a P-47, and if you don't think they look devastating, you ought to be there. And the thing that interested me was, we were walking along by a river, and we hadn't heard of the plane or anything, and apparently there was a riverboat down there that had been given a fighter boys some problem, and this P-47 came over the hill, had throttled his engine way back, and it didn't make any noise, and the first thing we knew, you could hear rat-tat-tat-tat, and you looked up and the dust was coming right towards you, just like this, while these bullets were hitting. And you didn't have time to even say a prayer. And I figured we'd had it, and when he got about as far as from here over to the sink, he stopped firing, went over the road, started firing again. So, and he was after the riverboat. So when that book came out, that God is my co-pilot, I think this proved it a good many times that somebody up there was watching out for me. My body weight went from 180 to 120. The best thing that we had while we were in prison camp was the Red Cross parcels. And the American Red Cross parcel, the International Red Cross parcel, was the best of any of them because they had vitamin C in it, they had toilet paper, they had matches, they had cigarettes, they had a little can of jam, a can of Klim. Anybody know what Klim is? M-I-L-K. Backward. and they were supposed to get one package per week per prisoner. And towards the end of it, we were lucky to get one every 2 or 3 weeks for 10 people. And I remember one day you form little groups. They called them combines, and only one person a day got food, and all the rest of them were sorted. And he was the last one to get the divvied up portions. So you can imagine how careful they were to cut it even. And they decided they were going to make a pie. We decided we were going to make a pie. So they took a jam, the sea ration cracker, cracked it all up. That was the cover. Took a Klim and beat it up and made a fill-in, and used the cracker crumb for the crust. Put the filling in, put the trimmings on, everything, and each one of us was 10 of us in a group, so we got a piece of pie about like that. But we had our piece of pie because I never heard, now remember, I told you the age group here, between this young lad here and them. Mostly, I think most of you gentlemen at least would agree that during that age, you probably talk about the ladies quite a lot. You start talking about your lady friend, to your girlfriend, to your mother, anything, and inside of probably 30 seconds it was back to food. Everybody was hungry. Now, the Red Cross parcels helped. We were liberated by Patton's Third Army on the 5th of May, 1945. They took out the worst medical cases first, and I mean, we were liberated on the 29th of April, and I was back in the military on the 5th of May, and they flew us up to Paris, and we took an airplane eventually home from Paris to New York, and I was assigned to a hospital down in Framingham, Mass, called Cushing General, and it was basically a nerve hospital, because Cushing was a noted nerve surgeon back before World War II. Now, I'd rather answer questions than to talk anymore, because I think you know what you're interested in, and I'll try to answer any question you ask as truthful as I can. Any questions?
Gerry,
Yeah.
when did you get a chance to talk to your family?
Oh. That's what I'm after, thank you. Anybody know what this is?
Other way.
Huh?
There you go.
Oh, yeah.
What is it?
Female.
What?
Female.
Female.
I can't hear.
V-mail.
V-mail. Yeah, you write on this, they fold it up, take a picture, take a picture of it, put the picture on a film, send it on a film, they'll probably put 10,000-15,000 letters.
Oh.
And it saved, I read one time how many millions of pounds of freight is saved by those emails. Well, actually, my folks, my dad, I lost my mother in August of '44, but my dad got this email from me before he heard from the military. Up until he got this letter in the mail, he did not know I was alive. And there was no way they could, because I never got into the Red Cross chain. And there's a young lady here in the audience on there is mentioned in this letter. And any other questions? Yeah.
I was surprised how quickly you were, helped out after your crash. That you were operating on so quickly. Why was that, do you think?
Well, if over there at that time, and I did not know it, and the natives came at me with gun forks, pitchforks, rakes, hose, clubs, and I thought I was sure going to be done in, and the Germans formed a circle around me and protected me, so I thought. And when about 4 years ago, I took a family back, and we went to Italy and to retrace the steps that I was in basically while I was over there. And I'd always been a little scared that I thought I might have been killed by the natives. And I said, and I wrote this right in my book, that I thought I was surely going to be done in. And the Italians said, oh, no. We have a underground, and we got quite a few flyers up in the mountains, and if we could have gotten to you first, and with a good chance that we could hide you before the Germans found you, we would have protected you and gotten you back, if we possibly could, but to your own lines. Which was fine. And they said what we did is if we couldn't get them legally, we would make believe that we wanted to kill them, because then that put us on the sides of the Germans, and that kept us out of trouble. And I don't know how many times I got thanked for us liberating the Italian. Now this is up in northern Italy, right at around the end of the northern Bra Pass. I don't know how many times we were thanked for liberating them from the Nazi. And they hated the Nazis worse than we did, a lot worse. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
When you were being marched here, there, and everywhere, did you have news of the war? I mean, were you apprised of what was happening where, and do you feel like you knew what was going on?
We probably knew more about what was going on than the people back here in the States, because, number one, somewhere in camp, and all the time I was in camp, I never asked any questions, but there was a group made up of, I'll say, real smart people. And because no matter what you was looking for in a prison camp, you could find almost somebody that was a real specialist. And we had a group that would get together at a certain time at a certain place, and if the German guards were there, they just moved to some other place, and they just drifted in, drifted out, and nothing special. And they'd put a little radio together. They'd listen to the BBC. We had a fellow that could take shorthand, so he'd take it down in shorthand. Then they'd pass it to clerks that could read shorthand, and they'd copy it over longhand, and pretty soon it was about 12 or 14, 20 copies, whatever they needed for the barracks. And then it was distributed around each barracks, and if the Germans intercepted one of them, a little while later another copy appeared. And so we had what the BBC said, but we also had new prisoners coming in every day that told us what was going on. And there's two sides of Patton. There's those that loved him, there's those that hated him, but there was nobody in between. And he was the one that liberated us, and he told all of his troops to leave all of the food that they possibly could, all the food that they had with the PWs, and that they'd live on the land until they could get better rations. And so we had in the camp, we had a person that was in charge, was called the man of confidence, and he worked with the German officers and the American officers to make a deal on the liberation of the camp. And the prison camp is run exactly like the military, because the senior officer in the camp is automatically the commanding officer of the camp, and then this is by your serial number, and you would know that he's been in if it's 32 and this one's 33, this fellow was in one before him, so you knew who exactly. You didn't have to take anybody's word for it. And we had a colonel by the name of Colonel Lemuel Good, and he'd stand up for us. He'd tell us not to go out in the rain, and the Germans would take dogs and try to put us out, and he'd tell us to stand flat. But he also was a disciplinarian, and he said, if we don't keep our personal habits clean, if we don't maintain a clean living and everything, we can't expect the Germans to do anything for us. So he said everybody will be clean shaven. I've got a razor blade over here, and I use the same razor blade from November until May. And there was a good many tears shed. But, and was one water spigot for about 450 men. And it was cold. And this is we marched from Nuremberg to Moosburg, 10-day march. And one of the things that nobody's been able to answer satisfactorily for me, but the only churches that were open to us were the Catholic churches. The Protestant churches wouldn't let the POWs in. The Catholic churches, we slept on the pews, we slept under the pews, we slept on the altar, we slept anywhere that we could get inside. And while we were on the march with the Germans, three German guards and the 5 contingency, we stayed with a family for about 3 or 4 days. They were farm people, and I never saw any food around there. And the guards would leave about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because they made me promise. I was a senior officer, and they made me promise that we would not try to escape. Well, at that time, I'd made up my mind that it was a safety in numbers first, and secondly, that the war was coming to an end, and to stay together, we'd be a lot better off. And so after the guards left, reasonable time, out would come black bread and jam and meat, and we'd get a feed. And they always said, we do not want the war. This is the civilian. He said, it's all politics. We have a boy on the Western Front, on the Eastern Front, and he said they are treated terribly by the Russians. And he said, we don't want the war, but he said it's all politics. And of course, if they don't do what they've said, it didn't take they didn't hesitate to liquidate them, as you all know, if you've read your history. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Talk about tea time in your
Tea- oh, tea
POW
time.
camp.
The British are great. We had in our squadron office a picture during one of the offensive, and here's the shells breaking down and limbs coming down, and down here at the bottom here's a British Tommy boiling the billy so he could have his tea. War going on. But when they got their tea, then that was a whole different story. And every morning on the way from Nuremberg to Moosburg, at 10 o'clock and at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the guards might as well go away because they wouldn't go until they had their belly. They boiled the belly. And we all had different fire arrangements. Some of the prisoners that had been in for a long while had got enough tin together and made a bellows, and they could burn charcoal, coal, or wood. And then there's one, like I've got over here, that's a very simple thing, just 2 cans and 2 pieces of wire, and that one block of wood that's right in front of it will cook that little can on the inside just full of potatoes, just cook it. And potatoes you have to cook to get any nutrition out of them, so everybody had some way had to cook potatoes. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
What rank were you in the cook?
That's embarrassing. I'll tell you why. The question is embarrassing, but the answer is.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was shot down to 2nd lieutenant. I got my 1st lieutenant's in prison camp. I got my captaincy in a hospital. And I never did a day's work for the military from the time I was shot down until I was okay?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry.
I have a little problem hearing, so if I don't answer you, yell again. Yes.
When Patton liberated,
What?
When Patton liberated Moosburg, how many prisoners were there?
Well, that's an interesting story because I think the New York Times came out the first day with something like 40 or 50,000, and the next day they corrected and it was well over 500,000. And I wanted to take the family to Dachau because that was a political prison, and there's several books been written about it, and we had a doctor in town, unfortunately he's passed away, that went in a couple of days within 48 hours after Dachau was liberated, and he says you just can't believe the situation there. Starved to death and everything. And I understand that Eisenhower, up in the one by Poland, he made all of the civilians within a 10-mile radius go down and go through the slaughterhouse. And because he said they can't say they didn't know it was there. So, no, it was not a good scene, and fortunately, we had very low death rate. The Japanese prisoners were about 1 out of every 3 died. The Germans were about 1 out of every 10 died, or maybe 11. So it's the Germans by and large tried to live up to the Geneva Convention to some respect. The food that we got from the Germans was very limited. It was black bread, and what they did is used sawdust on the breadboards to keep the dough from sticking to the breadboard, and incorporated a reasonable bit of sawdust, very fine sawdust, in with the bread. A lot of prisoners had a syndrome of intestinal problems, and the VA in Ohio came up with the conclusion it was because of the low quality diet and the wood fibers and everything that caused this. And the pilot that I had was shot down with. I was talking with his son about 3 years ago, and we were talking, and he said, "You got the same problem my dad had." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You've been having a lot of intestinal problems," and he said, "My dad had," and he said, "Your surgery sounded identical from what he told me, what you told me." And he said the VA in Ohio came to that conclusion that because of the wood fiber and low quality diet, that many of them had the same syndrome. And so we had the black bread. Then we had sauerkraut. I never knew sauerkraut came in so many colors. There's a white sauerkraut, there's a brown sauerkraut, there's a combination, there's a purple sauerkraut, and we got all of them. And with Longwell, I wouldn't eat sauerkraut. But now I do, it's pretty good stuff. And then we had a soup, with 2 kinds of soup. One was, you don't know, how many in here know what a mangle is? You know what sugar beets look like? Yeah. Well, mangle's about twice as big as a sugar beet, and they grow them overseas to feed livestock. And what they do, take these mangles and put them through a hand-driven machine, make those little fries that we get in the store here, and they'd cook those, and we used to have a contest to see who got the most cockroaches in there. And then we ate the cockroaches because it was protein. And a lot of people say, I couldn't do that. If you've been hungry, you will.
Yes.
I'll tell you.
Yeah.
Any other question? Yes.
What was your interaction? Was there much interaction with the Germans that were holding you? Was there?
There's a black market. Remember I said we got cigarettes in the Red Cross parcel? 5 cigarettes would get you a loaf of black bread. And they had, the people that had been PWs for a while were pretty shrewd. They had the black market, and they could tell. When I got to Spital, I went into a room, and we hadn't been there 10 minutes when I was with people, British from Africa, and they said there's a group of guards coming down, going through the room, and you don't know anything. I said, "Yep, understand." So they came in, they came right over to me, and they said, Smitty, where is the heater? I said, what are you talking about? Where's the heater? I said, I don't know, I just got here. I said, I don't see any heater. Well, I was sitting on top of it. They'd taken and cut, they'd had a piece of board there. They took it out, built a shelf back here, put all of the heating, I'll tell you about the heating in a minute. They put all the heating stuff back there, pulled it over, brushed some dirt into those cracks that were left, and then put my chair right on top of it. And within 15 minutes from the time they left the compound, we were drinking hot tea. What was their heating device? Very simple. Take that larger can that you can see there, take a strip of wood about that long, put on 2 strips of metal, connect a wire to each piece of metal, put a little bit of salt in the water, plug it in, and you got a water heater. And the old baby warmer bottles used way back when used that same principle. You may remember plugging in a electric unit and it heated with a little salt in it. That was the same thing. And we traded, and to the best of my knowledge, I was never intentionally hurt. And a lot of people can't say the same. And it all depended upon the temperament of the commanding officer that you were under, just the same as it is anywhere else. Any other questions?
Mr. Smyth, out of the 500,000 POWs that were with you at the end when you were rescued by Patton's Army, how many of those 500,000 were Allied prisoners of war from Germany, from France, from Belgium? Or was it just
I can't answer that. I don't know. I never saw it broken. I never saw it broken down.
Never broken down.
I can tell you this. At Mooseburg, it was my wife and my good fortune to go around in '79, and we stayed at a pension, and again, not knowing the political lay of the field, I was not about to cause a ruckus, but my wife said to the lady, she tried to tell her that I was a prisoner of war, and I knew enough German so I could explain that to her, and she said Kinder, so I knew what that meant, so she went and got a granddaughter who spoke fluent English, and she went and got a granddad who was a prisoner of war of the English. And so he took us around in a Mercedes and showed us the camp and told us, and there was a tremendous number of Russians in our camp. They were in a separate unit, separate away from us, but they were in the same jurisdiction. And the Russians got treated much worse than the Americans. Does that answer your question? I can't tell you numbers, but Gordon, have you got that sheet with you?
I do, but this is not just about Mooseburg.
No, I know, but I thought the numbers that you looked up for me were telling.
So what's the number that you talk about for the total people that were involved with World War II, served?
16 million in uniform in World War I. I remember World War II. I remember that. I was one of 16 million.
So what Dad wanted to know was just, some statistics about POWs. So in World War II, there were 130,200 POWs that were captured.
That's the Americans.
And returned. These are Americans only. Of those, 14,000 died while they were POWs. And of the 130,000, 116,000 returned back to U.S. military control. They were repatriated, just like you were.
Yeah.
By 1982, of those 130,000, about 88,000 were living. In 1999, about 49,000. By the year 2006, it was about 26,000. And as of now, we're estimating it's something under 14,000 of those 130,000.
Yeah, and I think that says it all.
Yeah, there's a graphic that's up in the front too, if you'd like to see it, that my wife Sue put together. But just illustrates what's happened to the POWs who served America in World War II.
Those are the numbers he read off, and it shows the relativity of the numbers. Now, I didn't get into any area where we had any mass shootings by the Germans, liquidation groups by the Germans that I know of. And as I said, personally, I was never intentionally hit. When we left Nuremberg, we did lose some people at the very end of the line, but it was unintentional. Our P-47s was a rail yard. All of the prison camps were put on rail lines, and we were in Nuremberg. We were right beside the railroad track, and there was a marshalling yard there. And as we were leaving Nuremberg to go to Moosburg, there was a lot of flat cars there with corrugated covers, and we came to the conclusion they were jet engines. And apparently the intelligence got back to our lines, and they came in and strafed that yard in good shape, and we lost 2 or 3 or 4 people on the very end of the line from the strafing, but it was certainly unintentional.
I have a question.
Yeah.
In terms of the conditions, where did you sleep on? What, like, did you have to sleep on the floor? I'm sure they didn't give everyone cots, right? I mean, what was it like?
It was the sleeping arrangements were the same in all the prison camps I was in. 3 layers, just 3 layers of boards, and they were close enough together so you couldn't sit down on them. You couldn't you had to lay down or stand up. The Pennsylvania would call it a bundling board, but it was a board about that wide that divided that level into 4 equal units. Then there was another one, then there was another one. So 12 people was on roughly a 4x8. And the mattresses were basically straw. And when we were in Moosburg, with nothing else to do except do some thinking maybe I should have done more. I got out of my bed and I reached over and I whacked that mattress as hard as I could. And my dormitory neighbors were not happy. They said, "Smith, if you ever do that again, we'll kill you." I never saw so many fleas in all my life. And when we got to the field station, this was in May, they just stripped everything that we had and put it in a bonfire, and we walked through showers and came out on the other end with clothing just to cover us until we could get more clothing. They could get more clothing in. Any other questions? I'd rather answer them and try to think of them.
I don't really have a question, but I just want to thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'll stay around and answer any questions because some of you people may not want to ask a question in front of all these people, but
I have another
I'll be
question
here
to
a
ask you.
while and
Mr. Smith.
answer any questions.
Gerry, here's one right here.
Since the Germans were taking care of you for 6 months, feeding you and providing you with shelter, you didn't get paid for 6 to 7 months. When the U.S. Army Air Force finally caught up with you, promoted you, and gave you all that back pay, What did you go eat?
What did I go eat?
What did you do?
Yes, if you read that letter there, it says, get chocolate, get chocolate, get chocolate. No, and I tell you, it was my weight, and it was, when we went in to buy clothes in the PX in Paris, we wanted something that would fit fairly decent, and the people in the PX wouldn't sell them to us. They said, you're been on starvation diet. They said, you got to get something. Well, we couldn't do this when we got them, but I filled them out pretty soon.
Oh my God.
Gerry, have you been on a flight?
Beg pardon?
Have you been on a flight? You know,
Yes, I've been on the honor flight.
you have. Good
Yeah.
for you.
Thanks to a lot of good donators. Yeah, it's worthwhile. That's when I learned that I always figured the Marines had the biggest loss in World War II, and it's not. It was the Army Air Force, which surprised me to no end, because the Marines went in on those hellish islands in Asia, and I never dreamed, but I just got through rereading my history of the 320th Bomb Group, and quite a few of those guys didn't make it back. And I want to thank these two people here. Just again, think of this young man getting into an airplane, $1 million, 5 or 6 men under him, and plus the men under him. And that's why I think during flight school, everybody put in for single engine. Nobody wanted the responsibility of somebody else's life in their hands. But somebody had to, so as my pilot used to say, it's a job that needs to be done, we did it. Simple as that. Any other questions? Okay, have a good evening. I'm sorry.
With so little food that you had, what was your first good meal?
What was my first good meal?
Yeah.
Good Lord.
That you really, really enjoyed. I mean, really.
Probably the first good slice of bread I had. Remember now, I'll tell you a little story about that. As you know, I told you my weight went from 180 to 120, and all of my friends looked the same as I did. And when we got to the field hospital, they put MPs on the line, and we wondered, what's that for? Well, when they put food on our plate, a rat could have eaten it. It was that little of it. And we kind of complained, and they said, you know and I know that if you eat any more than that, you're going to be sick as a dog. So they limited us very, very much. And it was probably a full week and a half before they would let us go and take what food we wanted. And so I would say the very first meal, I don't remember what it was, except I do remember we raised so much ruckus that they came around about bedtime and gave us a half a slice of bread. Now, my train of thought. I'll get it in a second. Oh, the cow. The cow was maybe 25 miles from where we were liberated, and we had a big tent, probably about 20 beds in it. And that first night, I'd say probably half of the occupants were DeKalb internees, And during the night, we probably lost half of those
Oh.
because they were so starved, they couldn't even tolerate IVs, if you can picture it.
Oh.
So that tells you the cruelty that went on.
We had no idea of what you people went through. We can't even begin to know.
Beg your
I
pardon?
say, we can't even begin to know what you people went through.
Well, on the other hand, we survived, and that's the important.
Thank you for
Thank
that.
you.
Yes,
Thank
thank you, Gerry. We're honored to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your service and for your time tonight. Thank you all for coming. Oh, yeah.
Thank you for.
Gerald will be back in 2017, so.
That's right.